Learning. You can't stop it. You're constantly learning, you big old smarty pants. Sure, you want to be learning all the important stuff. How to have a good life, how to pay your bills, how to get the answers to the questions that will be on the next test. But instead, you're spending all of your time learning things like the latest dance moves to Fortnite, or how many gosh darn cat videos can I watch in one night before falling asleep? Answer's probably a lot. Hey! Let's talk all about learning. It's going to be a 3-video series. In this first video, we're going to talk all about classical conditioning. I'm Professor Alan Girding, and I love psychology. In today's video, we're specifically covering classical conditioning. When you think of classical conditioning, you should think of Ivan Pavlov, the Russian physicist who experimented on dogs. But what the heck does classical conditioning even mean? Well, we're going to break down a lot of vocabulary terms today into common, everyday English. Let's start with classical conditioning itself. Classical is just a term that means old or original. So when we combine that with conditioning, which is just a fancy word for training, what we have is the original training. That's right. When someone uses the word conditioning, don't get all confused. It just means training. So if I'm conditioning for an upcoming fight, all that means is I'm training for a fight. So we're going to cover just 5 things in the video today. The first thing we're going to talk about is Ivan Pavlov, Russian physicist, and tell his story of experimenting on dogs. It's not as cool as you might think if you're an animal lover, but at the same time, it's pretty important stuff. Second thing we're going to talk about are the principles of classical conditioning. There are 5 basic vocabulary terms that you're going to have to know and be able to use. And to help you, I'm going to translate those words just like we did with classical conditioning. But we're also going to play a game. Yay! The game's called Unconditioned Stimulus versus Neutral Stimulus. I hope you have fun. Third thing we're going to talk about are factors influencing classical conditioning. But the fourth thing, pretty fascinating stuff, because there are stories that happen in the history of psychology where I can't believe they're true. But they are totally true. And this is the story of John B. Watson and how he basically tortured a baby. Stay tuned for the story of baby torturing. And then finally, let's talk about vomiting and throwing up. Because if you've ever eaten something and gotten horribly ill and thrown up all over the place, you might be interested to learn all about learned taste aversions. With that being said, let's jump into the first of these 5 things we're going to discuss in this video of classical conditioning, Ivan Pavlov. Ivan Pavlov, this Russian physicist, did all these experiments on dogs. To help explain this, I'm going to jump to a really great video YouTube series called Crash Course by Hank Green. I really recommend you check it out. The link to his YouTube show will be provided below this video.
So the name Ivan Pavlov rings a bell. It's because his experiments are among the most famous in the history of psychology. His work contributed to the foundation of the behaviorist school of thought that viewed psychology as an empirically rigorous science focused on observable behaviors and not unobservable internal mental processes. Even though today we view psychology as the science of both behavior and mental processes, Pavlov's influence was tremendous. His research helped pave the path for more experimental rigor and behavioral research right up to the present day. Born in 1849 in Russia, Pavlov was never much for psychology. After giving up on his original aspirations to become a Russian Orthodox priest like his father, he instead earned a medical degree and spent nearly 20 years studying the digestive system, earning Russia's first Nobel Prize in his mid-50s for his research expanding our understanding of how stomachs worked. He didn't study human stomachs, though, because the procedures were terrible and cruel. He studied dog stomachs, and while researching those dogs, he noticed how the animals would salivate at a mere whiff of their dinner. At first, he found all that slobber annoying, but soon started to suspect that this behavior was actually a simple but important form of learning. He was turning out his famous series of experiments in which he paired the presence of meat powder, yummy, which got the dogs to drooling, with lots of different neutral stimuli, things that wouldn't normally make you drool, like a certain sound or shining a light or a touch on the leg. Then Pavlov observed after several of these pairings, a dog would start to drool just at the sound or the light.
And we are back. If you like that, make sure you check out Crash Course on YouTube. So that's basically Pavlov and what he did with the dogs. What's fascinating is a lot of people don't realize that what he did to the dogs was a bit invasive. He actually drilled holes into their salivary glands, attached valves to them to measure if those dogs were salivating just as much to the sound of the bell as they were the food. The answer is yeah, they were totally salivating just as much. Science! But now let's talk about the principles. These are the terms that you should know, and there's 5 of them. There's the unconditioned stimulus, the unconditioned response, also known as the natural response, the neutral stimulus, the conditioned stimulus, and the conditioned response. I have the last 2 vocabulary terms highlighted in red here because they're a little bit separate from the first 3. The first 3 happen before conditioning, and the second 2 don't show up until you've messed around with the first 3 and they transform into these last 2. But what the heck do these words mean? Don't get overwhelmed. We're going to break it down, translating style, right? Meow. We first have conditioning, which we already talked about at the beginning of the video. Remember, conditioning, just a fancy word for training. But what about these principles? We saw unconditioned, which sounds almost like untraining, but we don't mean undoing when we say unconditioned. Instead, it means natural or no training needed whatsoever. So then we have the stimulus and then the response. The stimulus is anything that causes something to happen. If you stimulate this, then the response is going to be the effect or the result of that stimulus. Now let's get a little bit creepy here. If the stimulus is tickling, what's the effect? Laughter. Yeah, sorry about that. I know that was a little bit nightmare inducing, but there you have some more translating. And then we have neutral, and neutral basically means nothing. So if something's neutral, zilch, nada, nothing's going on. So now we go back to our terms, and we have unconditioned stimulus. Now that we know that unconditioned means natural and stimulus means cause, put them together, and you have a natural cause for something. For instance, in Pavlov's example, you're going to learn that the natural cause is going to be food. If you give some dogs some food, they're going to have an unconditioned response. What is an unconditioned response? Well, that's going to be a natural reflex response. Now keep in mind, natural reflexes are always going to be a verb, an action, something that's happening. There's some great examples. There's blinking, there's kicking, there's jumping, there's salivating, like in Pavlov's example. There's even arousal. I don't necessarily mean sexual, but it can be sexual. Creep down. Let's move on. Now that we know what an unconditioned stimulus is, we need to know what a neutral stimulus is, so we can play the game unconditioned stimulus versus neutral stimulus. Remember, an unconditioned stimulus is anything that causes an unconditioned response, that reflex response. We previously gave the example of the stimulus being tickling, coochie coochie coo, no training necessary, you start laughing as a response. But what about a neutral stimulus? A neutral stimulus is anything that causes nothing. So if I give you an example and it doesn't cause any reflex, no blinking, no salivating, no jumping in fear, no crying, no laughing, no sexual arousal, anything like that, well then you know it's a neutral stimulus. And with that brief explanation, let's now play the game. Unconditioned stimulus versus neutral stimulus. Come on down, first example. First example is a pen being clicked. Click, 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 click. That noise. Is that noise causing you to blink? Is it causing you to salivate? Is it turning you on sexually? Don't admit it if it is, because that's a little unusual. If you're thinking, well, that didn't cause anything to happen, then which is it? The unconditioned stimulus or the neutral stimulus? If you said neutral stimulus, you're correct. Thank you so much, example 1. Let's come up with our second example as we continue this game of unconditioned stimulus versus neutral stimulus. Example number 2 is, your eye. Imagine I walk up to your eye and I blow into it. The stimulus is a blow of air into your eye. Does that cause your eye to do anything? Does it cause you to blink? Does it cause you to laugh? Does it cause anything? Well, if it does, which is it then? Is it the unconditioned stimulus or the neutral stimulus? If you said a puff of air into the eye is the unconditioned stimulus, you are correct. But wait, if it's an unconditioned stimulus, it has to have an unconditioned response. The puff of air into the eye is the unconditioned stimulus. What is the unconditioned response? If you said Blinking, you are correct. Hey, thank you so much. Second example, get out of here. Third example is a very dim light. It's a light, but it's dim, so imagine it's barely on. Because it's a dim light, is it causing you to salivate? Is it causing you to blink? Is it causing you to jump in fear? Is it sexually arousing you in any way? Ah! If not, which is it? Is it the unconditioned stimulus or the neutral stimulus? If you said neutral stimulus, guess what? You're correct. All right, one more example in this game of unconditioned stimulus versus neutral stimulus. Come on out, example 4. Oh, hi. I don't know what I was trying to show here. Let's suppose you really love hot dogs. So you see this hot dog, oh my, especially if you're hungry, what does that do to you? Anything at all? Or maybe this hot dog represents something that is really attractive to you. I don't know what floats your boat, but imagine that walks on by, boom, chicka, boom, chicka, boom. So this very sensual hot dog that looks oh so delicious, does that without any training cause anything? Or does that without any training cause nothing to happen? Is it the unconditioned stimulus or neutral stimulus? Well, if you said unconditioned stimulus, you are correct. But wait, if it's an unconditioned stimulus, it has to cause an unconditioned response. What's the unconditioned response? Well, if you really love hot dogs, the unconditioned response is salivating, because you're no different than Pavlov's dogs. No. That does it for unconditioned stimulus versus neutral stimulus. So let's go on back and talk about these principles. So now you should be familiar with the unconditioned stimulus and the unconditioned response and the neutral stimulus. And you definitely now know the difference between the unconditioned stimulus versus the neutral stimulus. But we still have yet to really break down the difference between conditioned stimulus and conditioned response. So how do we get a conditioned stimulus? Where does it come from? Well, we started with the unconditioned stimulus, which causes that unconditioned response. Separately, we have a neutral stimulus, which then causes nothing. But what happens if we were to add those two together simultaneously? You have an unconditioned stimulus. Think of any of the previous examples we talked about. It could be the tickling, or it could be the puff of air into the eye, or it could be that delicious, oh so sensual hot dog. And then you combine it with any of the neutral stimuli that we previously spoke of. For instance, it could be the dim light, or it could be the pen clicking, click, 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 click. And if we add those together, what we find is that the neutral stimulus becomes the conditioned stimulus. Because eventually you're going to learn to associate the neutral stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus. For instance, in Pavlov's example, there was the neutral stimulus of the bell, ding-a-ling-a-ling, and the unconditioned stimulus of the food. Oh, yes. But by ringing the bell, ding-a-ling-a-ling, and then giving food, here's some food, ding-a-ling-a-ling, here's some food, eventually, when the dogs heard the ding-a-ling-a-ling, they thought, oh my goodness, ding-a-ling-a-ling means food, and therefore, they'd start having the conditioned response. The conditioned stimulus causes the conditioned response. So now, if we break it down step by step, we had the 3 phases in Pavlov's example. Before conditioning, we had that neutral stimulus, the bell, ding-a-ling-ling, caused nothing to happen. Dog looks at the bell, what, I don't get it, just a bell, not a big deal. Show any dog any food, no training necessary, the unconditioned stimulus is the food, will cause the dog to start drooling all over the place. Hell yeah, food sounds amazing. Now, during conditioning, all we do is we combine the two, the neutral stimulus, ding-a-ling-a-ling, with the food, and the dog starts drooling. Hell yeah, I love me some food. But eventually, that neutral stimulus will no longer be neutral, because we can only call a stimulus neutral if it causes nothing to happen. But as soon as that dog starts drooling to the sound of the bell, before we even show any food, no longer is it the neutral stimulus, now it is the conditioned stimulus, which is now causing the conditioned response. Whew, man, I hope that made some sense, and now you're really comfortable with those 5 vocabulary terms, those principles of classical conditioning. Factors of conditioning, story time. I have a dog named Jiggles, and I classically conditioned Jiggles to salivate at the sound of a bell. Ding-a-ling-a-ling! I'd ring the bell every time I gave Jiggles a treat or some food. Oh, Jiggles was a very happy pug then, right? Unfortunately, this is what happened. I had to go out of town for the weekend, and I had my niece, Louise, come in to watch Jiggles. Now, Louise thought it would be hilarious to torture Jiggles with the bell. She would go ahead and ring the bell, ding-a-ling-a-ling, and not give Jiggles any food. Ding-a-ling-a-ling, nothing. Oh my goodness. And eventually, she just decided to throw that bell away, and that bell was somewhere in my closet that Louise hid, I don't know. But here's the thing. After so many times of Louise ringing that bell and not giving Jiggles any food, Jiggles eventually stopped salivating to the sound of the bell. This is what is known as extinction. Extinction is when what you previously conditioned has gone away. Much like the dinosaurs are extinct, hey, that learned behavior has now been extinct. But our story continues, because it's years later, and I get a call from Harvard. Bring, 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 bring. Hello, this is Professor Alan Girding, host of the show I Love Psychology. How can I help you? Yes, this is Harvard University. We hear you're a pretty good teacher, and we'd like you to come down to Harvard University and teach here. Huh. Well, I appreciate the offer, I said. But you have to understand, I was born in Cleveland, I was raised in Cleveland, and I've been teaching at Cleveland for years. I love the students there, I love the people, I'm not going anywhere. I bleed Cleveland, I'm gonna live in Cleveland. Oh, we're so sorry to hear that, because we were gonna give you a buttload of money. Oh, I understand. Well, I'll see you soon. I'm moving to Harvard. Clink, clink. So I get a new job at Harvard University. But I need to pack up my things. And as I'm packing up my things, I come across, deep in the depths of my closet, this little metal bell. I blow the dust off. Oh yeah, I used to use this years ago. And I ring it. Ding-a-ling-a-ling. What just might happen, even though Jiggles had that behavior become extinct, Jiggles comes tearing ass into the room, doing that whole dog spin that dogs do, all excited about the food. Hell yeah, food. It's as if Jiggles heard that ring and thought, wait a second, a bell ringing? That used to mean food! Oh my God, it's food! So Jiggles comes tearing ass in, like, great, oh, this is beautiful. Because I'm moving, now Jiggles has suddenly regained this training. This is known as spontaneous recovery. Spontaneous recovery is the reemergence of previously extinguished conditioned response after delay. Long story short, what was dead has come back to live after a lapse of time. Think of it this way. Extinction is when a conditioned stimulus goes back to being a neutral stimulus. Spontaneous recovery is, after a while, that neutral stimulus, all of a sudden, boom, comes right back to being a conditioned stimulus. We're getting all technical in here. I want this to happen. I want Jiggles to be trained to come to the sound of the bell, especially since I'm moving to a whole new house and a whole new state, whole new city. Because if Jiggles gets out, I want to be able to ring that bell, ding-ling-ling, to have Jiggles come run right back towards me. Heaven forbid Jiggles gets loose. Unfortunately, my new house is just down the street from a church. What's the problem with that? The church bell. Suddenly, ding-a-ling-a-ling, ding-a-ling-a-ling. And when that happens, what does Jiggles do? Jiggles just starts tearing ass down the street, going towards the church, thinking there's some big-ass meal waiting for Jiggles. This is horrible. Jiggles doesn't understand that the small bell means food, not the big bell. What is Jiggles experiencing? Jiggles is experiencing stimulus generalization. Stimulus generalization is when you think one type of stimulus is generalized into all those different types. It could be a light bulb, it could be the sound of a bell, it could be any neutral stimulus. It could be a pen click versus a pencil click versus the click of your mouth or fingers. This is stimulus generalization. Can I ever teach Jiggles the difference? No, Jiggles. Ding-a-ling-a-ling means food, not ding-a-ling-a-ling. Yes, Jiggles can learn the difference. And once Jiggles learns that difference, what has Jiggles acquired? Stimulus discrimination. All right. Whew. Those are the factors of conditioning. Hopefully those 4 vocabulary terms totally make sense to you. Allow me to tell you the I can't believe it's true, but it's totally true story of little Albert. It starts with John B. Watson. Now, John B. Watson was a huge fan of Ivan Pavlov. By golly, Pavlov, you saved the world of psychology from the perverted mind of Freud. Because Freud really dirtied the name of psychology, made it all sexual, and studying things with introspection, this idea of non-measurables, were being criticized as a soft science. Let's get the science out of the bedroom and back into the laboratory where we can observe behaviors. And this led John B. Watson to inspire B.F. Skinner and the start of behaviorism. But John B. Watson loved this idea of applying classical conditioning to human beings. He said, there are no instincts. We no longer need the term in psychology. Everything we have been in the habit of calling an instinct today is a result largely of training, belonging to man's learned behavior. John B. Watson was saying we could take all of those classical conditioning concepts and apply them to human beings, saying we are nothing but products of training. In that whole nature versus nurture argument, John B. Watson, the founder of behaviorism, was saying it's all nurture, baby. Everything we are has been taught to us. He even went so far as to make this crazy claim: give me a dozen healthy infants and I'll transform them into anything you want. You want a doctor or a lawyer? I'll have that baby operating on you in no time. Scalpel? You want an artist or a thief? I can train that baby to be one of those. You'll be like, where's my wallet? Baby's got it. He said that he could train any baby into anything regardless of the baby's talents, genetics, nothing. Nothing matters. It's all about the training. Now, a lot of people said, hey, we really like what you're doing with behaviorism, but we think you're taking it a little bit too far. Slow down. There has to be some room for genetics here. So to prove the scientific community wrong, what did he do? He got a baby. And this is where little Albert comes in, nicknamed B. This is an actual photograph. The gentleman that you see to the left frame is John B. Watson. The woman you see to the right frame is not John B. Watson's wife, nor is it that baby's mother. No, that is John B. Watson's student, an assistant. That will come up later on in the story. The baby is little Albert. Well, how did he get little Albert? Well, he was working on campus and he saw a custodian with little Albert strapped to her back and said, hey, you want me to watch that baby for you? I'll pay you. The custodian said, sure, wow. Not only is this free babysitting, but you're actually gonna pay me? Sure, that's great. And so then the experiments began. Now, I'm not sure if you can see, but there is something right in between little Albert's legs here, and that is a white rat. Now, a white rat. Does a white rat cause you to blink? Does it cause you to salivate? I don't know if you're in the habit of eating a whole bunch of white rats. No, it's a neutral stimulus. A neutral stimulus, especially for babies that haven't learned to be scared of rats or anything like that. So what did John B. Watson do? Anytime little Albert was interacting with this white rat, he would sneak up behind little Albert with a hammer in his hand and a metal bar and would go clang and would smash the two together. Now, a loud and unexpected noise right behind your head, is that an unconditioned stimulus or a neutral stimulus? Well, it definitely causes something to happen. So if it's an unconditioned stimulus, what's the unconditioned response? A fear response. In adulthood, it's usually jumping. How do babies express that? With crying. So sure enough, eventually, little Albert, anytime he saw that white rat, cried like crazy. Boom! Classical conditioning done. Now the white rat is associated with that fear, that loud clang. Now some people criticize John B. Watson for this, saying he just tortured a little baby, but he's not all that bad. Because John B. Watson was looking over little Albert near Christmas, so John B. Watson decided he would dress up as Santa Claus. And he got into little Albert's face and said, ho, 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 little Albert. And what did little Albert think of Santa Claus? He cried, wee, wee. Why was little Albert so scared of Santa Claus? Because of the white beard. Oh my. Interesting, thought John B. Watson. So he took off the beard and just showed little Albert the beard. Anytime he showed the beard, crying. Interesting. So then he got a white rabbit and showed little Albert a rabbit. And little Albert was crying at that too. In fact, it wasn't just white things, it was furry things. So what was little Albert experiencing? It wasn't just a white rat that scared him. It was white furry things. Anything white, anything furry, he was experiencing stimulus generalization. My goodness. And then he gave little Albert back, having not undone anything. And little Albert died shortly thereafter. No, not because of the torture, although I'm sure that didn't help. John B. Watson, he was fired. Was he fired because he tortured a baby? Kind of. Let's go back to this picture here. Why did they fire John B. Watson? They said, yeah, hey, you're torturing babies. That's not good. But that wasn't the only reason. John B. Watson was sleeping with that student. Hey, John B. Watson, you can't be torturing babies and sleeping with a student. We got to let you go. But I'm John B. Watson. I'm the father of behaviorism. I've applied Pavlov's concepts, classical conditioning to human beings. I've saved the world from Freud. I'm the president of the APA. How can you fire me? But he was let go. Didn't get another job in academia, but he was fine. You know why? Because he got a job in advertising, baby. Look at all that neutral stimuli. You see a beer? Well, now let's combine that with someone attractive. Now you're walking down the beer aisle saying, I don't know why, but I really want to have sex. Really want to drink that beer. Because you've seen so many commercials of them associating beer with things that are unconditioned stimuli that cause an unconditioned response. So let's break down little Albert's experience step by step. Before conditioning, the white rat caused nothing. The steel bar, before conditioning, naturally caused this fear response. So therefore, the white rat, neutral stimulus, the clang, well, that's the unconditioned stimulus, and the crying is the unconditioned response. During conditioning, you just combine those two. White rat, clang, and then finally, after conditioning, the white rat was all it took to get little Albert all upset. We're almost done here, so let's continue with evolutionary perspective. We need to talk about John Garcia and how he studied learned taste aversions. Have you ever thrown up before? Specifically, have you ever eaten something and thrown up because of what you ate? I'm talking food poisoning here. Maybe you're one of those people that have this exact same story. I used to eat blank all the time. I used to eat it at least once a week. But then one time I ate it and I got really sick and threw it up all over the place. And now even the thought of it makes me queasy to my stomach. If you are one of those people, you've experienced learned taste aversions. This was researched by John Garcia, or as I like to call him, John Barfcia, because he was able to take rats and give them flavored water that would make them violently ill, and they would never touch that flavored water again after just one pairing. This is perfect evidence of learned taste aversions, this evolutionary adaptation for human beings and other creatures to associate what you eat with how it makes you feel. If you get sick and you start throwing up everywhere, that's evolution at work, conditioned taste aversions. Because think of it, back in the day when we didn't know what made you sick and what didn't, you'd just be walking around caveman style, come across some berries. Oh, some berries, I'm so hungry. I wonder if these berries are gonna make me sick. I'm gonna taste them, a little bitter. All right, I'm gonna taste a little bit more while I am hungry, so maybe I take a whole handful. Oh my, I'm never touching those berries again. Why? Because your life depends upon it. So instead of having to do multiple pairings, like in the other examples of classical conditioning, with the bell and the food, ding-a-ling-a-ling, here's some food, ding-a-ling-a-ling, here's some food, it only takes one bad experience to potentially scar you for the rest of your life, avoiding that food. Thanks for researching that, John Garcia. And with that, we have learned all about classical conditioning. We talked about Pavlov and what he did when he messed with those dogs and made them drool to the sound of a bell. We talked about the principles with the unconditioned stimulus versus the neutral stimulus. We played the game. We learned about the factors influencing conditioning, about spontaneous recovery, stimulus generalization, extinction, all that jazz. We talked about John B. Watson and little Albert. And finally, we learned about taste aversions. Woo! We got through this classical conditioning together. Thank you so much. Don't forget, this is video 1 of a 3-part series. We still have to talk about operant conditioning, and we have to talk about observational learning next time. Hey, I really appreciate you coming here. If you want to, subscribe, pound that like button, do whatever. I'm Professor Girding. I love psychology.